for another Tech Talk. While everybody's getting logged in and getting logged in, Twitter, don't forget to log in, hash Layer 7 Live, and you can tweet your questions. Today we're going to talk about OpenID Connect and OAuth. And we're very excited to have Sascha Preibisch, who is a senior software developer here at Layer 7. And we've already got some pretty interesting questions coming through email. And so I see the viewers are, everybody's starting to log in. And just remind everybody, you're more than welcome to just kind of watch the broadcast. But we really do encourage you to ask questions. It's a really interesting topic. We've got a great expert today. And so if you have any question, just feel free to chat it through the window, tweet it, or if you're shy, you can email it to techtalk@layer7.com. So Sascha, if you would maybe want to introduce a little bit of OpenID Connect and how it's related to OAuth,
yes,
and then we'll dive right into some questions.
Okay. Hi, good morning. So I would like to start off with the relationship between OAuth and OpenID Connect. OAuth is the authorization protocol, and OpenID Connect adds authentication functionality to it. So OpenID Connect really uses plain OAuth 2.0 with some registered scopes and grant types. And we might start with the first question we had from Gustavo.
Sure, we had a question from Gustavo. I hope you've made it. I hope you've managed to log in. This was an email question. And Gustavo asks, I'm developing a site where business people can meet. What would you recommend to integrate my site with social websites like LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter? I'd like to have access to the LinkedIn user profiles.
Yes, so in this case, this would be a OAuth scenario where Gustavo would have to develop an OAuth client for those social networks. And then this client could access, granted by a user, their resources or their user accounts. So there's no OpenID Connect involved in that. If he wanted information about the user who granted this application, this client application, then he would be able to use OpenID Connect, which would return, deliver the username, for example, or the email address of the user who is just using his client application.
Okay. And we've got another email question that came in from Stephen. So I'll read it out loud. It seems like a fairly sort of a complicated, long question, but I'll read the whole thing. So Stephen asks, let's suppose I have an OAuth protected resource server, RS, that recognizes OAuth 2 access token, as well as the OpenID Connect ID token.
Mm-hmm.
I would like my RS to be able to accept tokens from a variety of OpenID providers, including our own OpenID service. On the other hand, each OpenID provider will likely have different token formats, and I really don't want my RS implementation to have to understand all of these formats. I'm assuming I want to have some conversion service that will recognize the token from a variety of different OpenID providers and convert them to one that my RS will recognize. So more generally, I may have a plurality of OAuth 2 resource services deployed, and I want them all to be accessible by SSO. I don't think I want to have some megascope that encompasses every RS. I envision some sort of secure token service that will accept the access and ID token issues by the authorization server for one RS as input credential to get an access token for another resource server. This brings scope hierarchy and equivalencies into play, and certain OpenID tokens may be more trusted than others. For example, we need to manage what scope might be allowed for each OpenID provider. I haven't seen literature to this specific problem in the OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect documentation, and wondering if you could speak to it.
Yes.
So, Stephen, I hope you're with us to listen to the answer.
Yes.
It's a good question. It's a long question.
Yeah, it's a long question. So I might go to the whiteboard and do a little drawing. I started off with something little. So the question was, Steven has got a resource server. And if he has got a resource server, he must, so he's implementing OAuth, so he must also have an authorization server and maybe a token server. This might be a second endpoint, but I will put a second server on here. So what I think that I understood in this question was that Steven wants to accept and validate incoming access tokens that his system didn't distribute. So in OpenID Connect, the main idea is to get user information about a user who granted a certain application. But this wouldn't mean that he has to accept any kind of access token. So the authorization server would usually issue an authorization code. The token service or the token server or the token endpoint would return a access token and also the ID token, which is specific to OpenID Connect. So the resource server would implement an endpoint which would be called user info. And the idea would be that Steven would implement a client application, or he would have a public API that used by developers implementing client applications. So these client applications would receive the access token, and they would also receive the ID token. Here's the client. And after the user has authorized and the client application and these tokens were issued, if the client wants to know who this person was, this client application would pass in the access token to the user info endpoint, and the user info endpoint would return the user-specific information. If I think the closest example that I can think of in this question would be a website with a so-called NASCAR login page. So on some websites nowadays, you can, as a user, you can either register yourself with this website, or you can use your login credentials or user credentials of Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or so. So to be able to more or less accept access tokens from other providers, it would be more or less the other way around. So Steven would implement different buttons to log in onto his website. So if a user comes onto his website and he has got the possibility to either register himself or to say, well, I'm registered with Facebook, use those credentials. In that case, this website of Steven would become a client calling Facebook using OAuth. He would do the handshake, he would receive an access token, and afterwards he would call the user info endpoint of Facebook, and Facebook would return, for example, a username and an email address. And then Steven could use those credentials to log the user into his system. So depending on the scenario, of course, if you have users that are able to register themselves on your website, there's no validation involved at all. So you're actually accepting any credentials this user is providing. So in that case, you could just call any user info endpoint and receive the values without validating them because the user decided he wants to use those credentials. So in a business scenario maybe, where you have got where you need a trusted relationship, you would, for example, make up a client using SSL with client authentication or something like that to ensure that you are connected to your partner side, and you would receive user information which can be seen as valid because you have got a trusted relationship to this second company, your partner company. So the main answer would be you don't have to accept any kind of tokens. you have to become a client, call another service to receive the values about a user. And if you have got, as you also mentioned, many resource servers, in our OAuth implementation, for example, we have got a separation between the resource server, the authorization server, the token server, and we maintain a separate token store which holds all access and refresh tokens, and a second a client store, and this client store holds all the client ID, client secret, those information. And our server talk to these stores to validate the incoming values. And this relationship is more or less internal, so we are using mutual authentication to assure that this is a secure communication channel. I hope this answered your question. If not, don't hesitate to ask again.
Yeah, and anybody else, excuse me, with related questions, don't be shy about tweeting them at hashtag Layer7Live or through the feed. Our next question is from Jamie. What's the difference between OpenID Connect and proprietary versions such as Facebook Connect?
Oh, I'm not an expert on Facebook, I must say that. I believe the main difference is that OpenID Connect provides a specification which is not proprietary and using only default or existing technologies like OAuth without any really extensions except for registering certain scopes which represent a group of claims like username, first name, last name. And what's the second part I wanted to say? Yeah. So, and another grant type which would include ID token. So I can't talk about Facebook Connect, I'm sorry for that.
Okay. But we got another question coming in through Facebook. Also, it seems as though maybe the Twitter API is a little bit busy or slow right now. So if you've tweeted questions, it might take a minute for them to actually update. So you could chat them in the window as well. But we should get them, but I'm getting a little bit of a Twitter API busy message. So Mark asks, most of our customers authenticate with us using or through SAP's UME.
Mm-hmm.
And how might OAuth be leveraged in this scenario?
Okay, again, I don't know that technology, but I mean, I've got a simple example of how OpenID Connect works in my head. So, if you have got different accounts on different websites, you have to maintain all your data on these different websites. So, if I want to shop at a store A, I have to register myself with my name, with my shipping address and the credit card information, and do this again and again. If other websites would be OAuth-enabled and OpenID Connect enabled, they could just use the OAuth protocol to receive the access token, and afterwards request the user information about the user who granted the application. So, depending on the scenario and how secure or how, what's the English word again? How the validity of these credentials are, you have to build up a untrusted or a more trusted relationship between the partners you are talking to. Is that an answer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Mark, if you had a kind of a secondary element to that question, or maybe something even more specific, Sascha could probably talk to it.
Yeah.
So keep those questions coming. So OpenID Connect, is that how new is it? Is it relatively new?
Yes, it's still a work in progress, more or less. There are first implementations for testing purposes. but the working group is still rewriting or rewriting the specification and getting more details into it as more implementations exists and more developers try working with it. More questions come up, of course, and it's in the implementer's feedback draft right now. So it will take a while until it's done, more or less, but it's a really interesting and upcoming standard, which enables users, hopefully, on the internet not to authenticate with, or not to maintain their data on several websites, but maybe on one or two, and other websites could leverage this data using OpenID Connect and OAuth.
Could you, sort of without going into real specifics, mention some sort of use cases that you see, maybe using our OAuth toolkit, or something you see, sort of on a daily basis?
Yeah, for example, if you want to download a certain content of Layer 7's website, you have to register if you download a white paper or something. So if this website would have a button, use my OpenID Connect provider's information, then you wouldn't have to register again. You could just press this button, and the Layer 7 website could use the dynamic registration feature of the OpenID Connect specification, and then get the information, the user information from social networks, for example. That's the main, or that's one of the use cases I see.
Okay.
And business related, if for example Layer 7 has a partnership with Acme Warehouse, and Acme Warehouse provides a few services, but Acme Warehouse wants to know who uses these services. So if Layer 7 would implement an OAuth client application to access a service on Acme Warehouse, for example, could do the same to access services on Layer 7's system. So a Layer 7 user would use the Acme Warehouse client application. This application would connect to Acme Warehouse. The user would say, download this catalog, and then the OAuth handshake would start. And then at the login page of Acme Warehouse, the Layer 7 member would say, well, I haven't got an account with Acme Warehouse. Why not use my Layer 7 credentials? So in that case, the Layer 7 user would press the button, L7 credentials. And in that case, in that moment, Acme Warehouse would become a client of Layer 7, would walk through the OAuth handshake, would call the user info endpoint, would receive the username and email, for example, and use those credentials to log the user into their system. And then the Layer 7 user could download the catalog without the need to register at Acme Warehouse, and Acme Warehouse would still know who the user was.
Right. Perfect. Just another reminder to keep your questions coming in. It looks like we have another one through Facebook. But like I said, the Twitter API seems to still be busy. So unfortunately, if you've tweeted a question, I'm not getting it. So maybe you could try to go through the live stream chat or a Facebook chat, or even email it in. But another question through Facebook goes, do the resource server, authorization server, and token server all need to reside in the same place in the architecture, or can they be separated?
No, they don't have to. They can be separated. And one of the differences between OAuth 1.0 and OAuth 2 is the separation of these servers. So OAuth 1 didn't talk about that. OAuth 2 heavily talks about the separation. So you can surely have a resource server, an authorization server, and a token server if you like.
Okay, so they can definitely be separate.
Yes, they just need to be able to validate tokens. So if the token server issues an access token, the resource server needs to be able to validate this token. So for example, in our implementation, we've got a validation point which is accessible through the resource server and the token server.
Okay. So they could reside in the same place?
They could, yes.
They could, but they don't need to.
They don't need to.
They don't need to.
No.
Okay. And just in general, you sort of touched on it in the beginning, but why do you need OpenID Connect and OAuth? Like in that relationship, why are the two together?
Okay. So OAuth is an authorization protocol, which is very important to understand. Many people, when they talk about OAuth, they think they can handle authorization with authentication with that,
Right.
but that's not the case. So a user might authorize an application to access certain resources, but this application doesn't know anything about the user who granted the access. So if this client application would need information about this user, authenticated information, it would use OpenID Connect, which adds authentication.
Right, okay. Of course. Again, keep your questions coming. I just want to mention too, July 12th, we've got an upcoming webinar featuring Ken Lane on how to run a successful hackathon for your open APIs. So July 12th, go to the website and register for that. It's going to be really awesome. And it features Ken Lane, who's the API evangelist. So how to run a successful hackathon for your open APIs. And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to be doing another tech talk, July 24th, and that's going to feature Mike Amundsen again, our API architect, our principal API architect, and he's going to be discussing hypermedia APIs. So keep your questions coming. We don't actually have one in the queue right now, and I think it's because I'm missing most of the Twitter ones. So I don't know, Sascha, if you wanted to maybe make a few more comments, if there's anything else maybe we haven't touched on around OpenID, maybe where it's going, where you see it going in the next, few months kind of thing, or...
Yeah, so as I said, there's a lot of work going on in the specification. We are also trying to keep track of that, using the mailing list, adding comments, and I really hope to see this specification being finalized in the next few months, maybe, because I really see an advantage for users, for easier authentication as an easier authentication protocol through the web.
So like as a user, not a developer,
Yeah.
or not a, not on your side, but as a user, with my mobile device, and I'm in apps all
Yes.
the time and on the web, how does that affect my user experience? Like for example, I don't know if this might have something to do with it or not, but if I'm on my iPhone and I get an email from LinkedIn, say, somebody wants to connect, or there's a comment, or there's maybe a job I might be interested in. If I click that link, it wants me to download the app, but I've already got that app. And so I don't know, does OpenID Connect help in that sort of a user kind of experience? Sometimes you tend to fumble around in your apps a little bit. It's not always, especially with Facebook and Twitter and all the APIs going on with Hootsuite and Instagram. So I wonder how OpenID Connect is going to affect the user.
So OpenID Connect will surely help you maintaining your personal data, because you would only maintain it at one spot if everything works out fine, and if social networks implement this protocol, for example.
Right. So if they do.
If they do, yeah. But I'm pretty sure they will.
Right.
Yeah. So the working group is a working group of also like Google is included and Microsoft is included.
Okay.
So there are quite a few big companies that work on the specification, and they will surely implement it also.
Right. I don't want to go back over too many things, but I've noticed that Steven has checked in.
Okay.
So I don't know if maybe he wasn't here in the beginning and maybe didn't hear your answer. And, I don't want to, bore the listeners who were here in the beginning, but maybe could you just go over the answer to his question?
Yeah.
Because he may or may not have been here in the beginning or not, but he's definitely here now. So
Hi, Stephen.
just Stephen, we just wanted to address your question. We did it off the top, and maybe you weren't checked in at the time, and so maybe you didn't actually hear the answer that Sascha gave.
So as I
and summarize the question, if that's okay.
Yeah. So if I got the question right, it was about how can I validate access token that I didn't issue myself. This was what I got out of that question. And the answer was that you actually don't have to validate access tokens that were issued by other systems. So OpenID Connect adds the possibility to get user information about a user that is not registered on your system, but who has granted an application that can access your OAuth secured system. So what you would do would be, if a user wants to use your services, if he uses a client application and hasn't got credentials on your system, you would become a client using OAuth and OpenID Connect, connecting to, for example, Facebook, work through the OAuth handshake, receive the access token, and then call the so-called user info endpoint, which will return information about the user that wants to access your system. So depending on the use case and the relationship to the identity provider, you can use it for social network, social login cases with a NetsCar login where you can use Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and so on. Or in a partner-based relationship, you would have a more trusted relationship, and you would receive valid data, for example, valid user information, because you are trusting your partner. So there's no need for you to accept any kind of access tokens in any format, and you would probably not need this conversion service you were asking about. So you issue access tokens, and you will receive access tokens for clients calling about your system, calling your user info endpoint. And you ask about more than one resource server or authorization server. So in that case, your resource server or servers need to be able to access your token store, where you store all your access tokens, refresh tokens, or client credentials. I hope that helps.
Yeah. So again, hopefully, if you were here in the beginning, it's not too repetitive. And Stephen, if you have a related question, feel free to chat it through. I see you're here. So if you need clarification on anything, or if that's not exactly what you meant, feel free to ask again. Because we've got another question. So if you can think about that and then maybe do it again, or if the answer is fine, that's great. Here's another question from Jamie. Do you have any advice for client-side OAuth interactions from machine-to-machine communication that's not human-driven?
So if I get that right, there's no user that needs to authorize a client application. But still, for example, if you have got a mobile phone, that's not human-driven. So the first case I could think of, well, it's still human-driven, but if you have an application on your phone of an airline, for example, and you want to browse the schedule of their flights, you could just access their system. It would still use OAuth, but without authorization of the user, because it's not the resources of the user itself that are being accessed. No. The client application would authenticate itself, but you wouldn't see that. So, I mean, they're still human-driven, because you are the human who wants to use this application. Maybe, Jamie, you can explain a few more details, what exactly you mean by that. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, maybe just clarify or give us an example of a scenario.
If this wasn't the answer.
if the answer wasn't what you were looking for. Yeah, and again, just get your questions in. I know that there's lots of people watching, so if you've got anything to add or any questions or anything that we've talked about that you wanted Sascha to kind of revisit or go over, feel free to chat them in. Again, like I said, the Twitter API doesn't seem to be working right now, and I don't think I'm getting my Twitter questions. So if there are any, try to check in and chat, please, through the Facebook or through live stream itself. You can also email them in, and if we don't get time to do them today, we can reply through the email anyway. So it's techtalk@layer7tech.com. And if Jamie, if you don't want any clarification, then and I don't see any other questions. So once again, I'll just mention Tech Talk again in 2 weeks. So that's July 24th for Hypermedia APIs, and we're going to welcome back Mike Amundsen, our principal API architect. And then later this week, we've got a webinar featuring Kin Lane. That's July 12th, and it's on how to run a successful hackathon for your open APIs. And that's going to be really interesting as well. So, Jamie's followed up on his question. Thanks, Jamie. If an app needs to authenticate locally and then do single sign-on onto a resource server using OAuth.
If an app needs to authenticate locally and then do single sign-on to a resource server, it seems like the interactive nature of OAuth makes that difficult. I'm sorry, I'm not really getting the point of the question. If an app needs to authenticate locally
and then do single sign-on to a resource server using OAuth. It seems like the interactive nature of OAuth makes that difficult.
I'm not so sure about that. In the end, the OAuth protocol isn't very difficult. It's just 2 or 3 interactions, and then you would have the access token that could be used to access resources or to get user information. So I'm not really sure what you're pointing to. I'm sorry for that.
Essentially, Jamie says, essentially, how can I have a client perform the OAuth interaction for me?
Yeah, I mean, the OAuth handshake would run behind the scenes.
Okay.
So you as the user wouldn't really see it.
Right.
You would just see a login page, depending on the use case, and then you would access any resources. So we had a follow-up from Stephen also.
Yeah, so Stephen, to his question, as an RS sorry, I've lost that question. Jose, can you get that question up for me? Sorry, it's cut off at the bottom. As an RS implementer, I may need to redirect the client back to an AS server to get an access token my RS recognizes, but I don't want the user to have
the user re-enter credentials if they've done so already.
Right.
How does OpenID Connect help?
Sorry, we may need to redirect the client back to an AS server to get an access token. Usually you would have so the client would usually walk through the OAuth handshake, receive the access token, and then tries to access the resource server. So if that fails because the access token is expired, for example, the client would use the refresh token, and if that is expired, then you would the client application would have to walk through the handshake again. And if you don't want the user to log in again, then there's the so-called ID token, and the ID token talks about or represents a session. So if your ID token is still valid, it would mean that your client application or the client has been granted already by the user. So in OpenID Connect, I read the new specification just yesterday. There are different scenarios, and a scenario could be that a user has to log in again, or the user has to log in and grant the application again. So depending on the scenario and how these tokens are handled on the different servers, the user might not need to grant the application again,
Okay.
and might not need to authenticate himself again.
Okay, and it seems as though we've got the Twitter back up. So I think this might be a comment on Jamie's question
Okay.
by JCyrus2. I think if it is, maybe you can maybe tweet or if it isn't, maybe just send your question as a unique question. But it seems as though he's commenting on Jamie's thing. I think it's like SSO single sign-on that the client has the user creds, but do authorize using OAuth.
I think it's like SSO that the client has the user creds but do not authorize using OAuth. So in OAuth, there's a grant type, which is password, where the client application receives the user credentials. But the client should only use these credentials once, and this is to authenticate the user during the authorization step and to receive an access token. So the client application should not store the client credentials, the user credentials, which is one of the main reasons to use OAuth, that you as the user don't have to provide your credentials to any applications.
Okay. And then we've got a couple more questions in the queue. So another Twitter question from JCyrus2. Can we just use OpenID for OAuth and not use, or sorry,
For authorization.
yeah, can we just use OpenID for authorized authentication and not use OAuth for authorization and vice versa?
No, you can't. So
No.
OpenID Connect depends on OpenID Connect depends on OAuth too.
Right.
So the only addition OpenID Connect makes is certain scope values and an additional grant type. So you can't use OpenID Connect without OAuth. And it's OpenID Connect and it's not OpenID. This is a small but also big difference.
Right. Okay, and email question from Lynn. How is OpenID Connect different from SAML or similar to SAML? How is it different or similar to SAML? Also, you mentioned it as a web-based authentication protocol. How can it be used in the enterprise with legacy applications?
So
it's a good question.
So first of all, it's got nothing to do with XML or something. You don't really need a trusted relationship, and you don't have these attributes that can be added to a SAML token. You've got so-called claims which identify a single value of a certain user, and because it's using OAuth and HTTPS, it can be handled through REST APIs or can be used through REST APIs. Can I see the question again?
Yep. And then the legacy aspect of it.
Yeah, so
also you mentioned it's a web-based authentication protocol. How
Yeah.
can it be used in the enterprise with legacy applications?
Yeah, so the legacy applications, I assume you mean some kind of
Versioning, maybe?
native applications or very old applications. I'm not sure about that. I'm German, I'm sometimes misunderstanding English phrases. But
I don't know. My guess is she might be talking about versioning of applications. I don't know, Lynn, you can always email in and maybe clarify that a little bit.
yeah, so in our case, where we provide a gateway, you would host an endpoint, a REST endpoint that can be called via HTTP or HTTPS. And our gateway would call the legacy application using any protocol this application understands.
Okay.
And then that would be possible.
Right. So, like I said, Lynn, hopefully that answers your question. If not, you just fire off another email
Yes.
or chat it through. And if it comes in while we're still live, then we'll definitely answer it. And if not, we'll just write back and respond through email. And And then Jay Cyrus too says, thanks. So that sounds
You're
like
welcome.
you answered that question well. So thank you, everybody, for your questions. I'll just make one quick pass through email, through Facebook, and see if we have any last questions. Look, it definitely looks like the Twitter API is back up. So if there's any last questions with Twitter, we'll just thank everybody for coming and welcome, invite you to come back on July 24th for the Hypermedia APIs with Mike Amundsen. And thanks, Sascha, very much for answering all the questions. Thanks, Stephen, Jamie, Jay Cyrus, Lynn, everybody who asked questions. Thank you so much for your participation. Gustavo, that's right, we got it started with that question. So OpenID Connect is an interesting topic, and just want to say thanks to Sascha and thanks for all the great questions.
Thank you.
See you next time, 2 weeks, July 24th.